This is a special bonus edition of Judaism Unbound. Emma Goldman. Every year, the American Jewish Historical Society hosts a conference of American Jewish historians. In 2018, this conference took place at the National Museum of American Jewish History in Philadelphia. Dan and I were both thrilled to attend the event, and while we were there, we took the time to speak with a wide variety of scholars about artifacts in the museum exhibition itself. We looked at these artifacts both in their initial historical context and as a map onto contemporary Jewish issues. We're thrilled to now be releasing these conversations as bonus episodes on Judaism Unbound's feed. And in this episode, we hear from Judith Rosenbaum, the executive director of the Jewish Women's Archive. So what are we looking at? What's the artifact that you want to talk to us about today?
So I wanted to tell you about the handbill for the trial of Emma Goldman. Emma Goldman was arrested in February of 1916, for speaking out about birth control and disseminating information about birth control, which was illegal at the time under the Comstock Law, which prohibited the distribution of obscene information. And of course, birth control was considered obscene at the time. So the actual label for this artifact says that it was in 1911, but I think that's incorrect. She was arrested on February 11th, 1916, so I think that's probably where the 11 came from. She had been speaking out actually for years about birth control. Emma Goldman had trained as a nurse and midwife. When she was first arrested in the United States, she spent a year in prison in 1893, 1894. When she got out of prison, she went to Vienna and she studied to be a nurse and midwife. And it was there that she learned about birth control. And her experience as a nurse actually really made her aware of the need for birth control, the dire need for birth control, particularly for poor people who couldn't control their reproduction and how many children they had. But she recognized that it was an issue for middle-class women as well, for all women, and a really key piece of her understanding of what women's emancipation meant. And so she came back to the States around the turn of the century, and she started talking about and lecturing about many different issues around anarchism and women's emancipation and many other things, but also sharing information about birth control. We generally think of Margaret Sanger as the person who was kind of the leader of the birth control movement, and she was in many ways, but she actually was influenced in large part by Emma Goldman, although they later split over their tactics and politics. And for her, this was, no one wants to be arrested, and she wasn't really eager to go to prison, but she really saw this as an opportunity because she realized that this was the perfect chance to do more promoting, to turn her trial really into a national forum for the issue of birth control and use it as an educational opportunity. And so she used this trial as an opportunity to speak out and to make the case for birth control. And in fact, she brought a lot of progressives and writers and artists to her side when she was given a choice of a fine of $100 or 2 weeks in the workhouse. She chose the workhouse. And when she was released, she and her supporters held a big meeting at Carnegie Hall to kind of celebrate her release and also for her to, again, have a platform for sharing her ideas about birth control. And more than 3,500 people showed up at that rally. So she was also just a master at getting the word out and understanding how she could use her own political persecution as an opportunity to further her cause.
How does birth control fit into some of her other work around the same time period?
So Emma Goldman is really a fascinating character, and it's part of why I find her really inspiring is that she was very idiosyncratic, and she very much had her own view of politics and how politics worked, and a very, very broad view. She was an anarchist, but she didn't necessarily toe the anarchist line either, because she was very focused on personal freedom of expression, free love, the right to think and feel and experience joy and passion to the extent that you could. She did, in some ways, cross lines with feminists who were also working on some of these issues, but she departed from them in other ways. For example, she was anti-women's suffrage, mostly because she felt like voting wasn't really going to make any change. And we knew that because we saw that men's voting hadn't really produced the world that she wanted to live in. And she saw that in the states and countries where women had the vote already, they also had not managed to create any sort of revolution that she wanted to see. And so she felt that that was really a system that was broken and that couldn't be fixed by just access to the rights of voting. For her, women's emancipation had to do with many things that actually I think are very relevant today, because she talked a lot about both what she called sort of external and internal tyrants. And she talked about the fact that, okay, so women might be able to have rights to be trained for certain professions and have some access there. But you know what? There's a lot of forces that systemic forces that they face in terms of not being paid the same amount or not being treated the same way, or then not being able to be married. And if they are married, then they may have a second shift at home, and not being able to control their own reproduction and deciding who they love and when. She considered marriage a form of legalized prostitution, so she was pretty anti-marriage. She said it's actually worse than prostitution because people are married for life, whereas for a prostitute, you are paid by the hour or the night or whatever, and then you're free to move on. But she talked a lot about this idea of inner tyrants, and which she really saw as the ways in which we are slaves to cultural expectations and our own sense of what it means to be a woman or be successful. And I think that is very much still a problem in the 21st century.
I feel like in the scholarly community, this probably isn't as much of an issue, but I think in many people's minds, when they hear things, you used the phrase free love at one point, when you hear about feminism, I feel like people jump to the mid 20th century and they don't think to jump back much earlier than that, certainly not to the 19-teens. And so I guess I'd love to hear from you just what can she do to poke some of our understandings of American Jewish history and American history more broadly? Yeah,
so the main feminist issue I think of that people associate with that time is suffrage, and I've already talked a little bit about how she didn't toe that line. Emma Goldman in her time was in America called the most dangerous woman in America because of her anarchist beliefs and because she did not shy away from thinking that violence was an appropriate method for protest and making change. She herself actually said the most violent element in society is ignorance, and her main way of making change was education, not violence, although she was certainly part of conversations about violence and some planning with, for example, Sasha Berkman. Then there's a photo in the exhibit of Emma and Sasha Alexander Berkman, who were lifelong friends and lovers and compatriots. They both went to prison for speaking out against the draft for World War I, and then they were deported to Russia. She didn't stay long in Russia because she realized she wasn't willing to toe the communist line either. And when she got there, she spoke out against things she saw there, and she was deported and left Russia and spent the rest of her life kind of wandering around. But because she was an anarchist, for a long time, Emma Goldman got kind of a bad rap. And also because as an anarchist, she was pretty anti-religion, the Jewish community saw her as sort of anti-Jewish. And I think that is that's a real misunderstanding and a missed opportunity for understanding a kind of secular Jewish politics and culture. Emma Goldman was born in Kovno in Lithuania in 1869 and came to the States when she was about 16. But she was very much shaped by her Jewish upbringing and by a sense that there was a Jewish thrust for justice, for a universal kind of justice, and for argument and protest, that was something that she saw as a part of her Jewish being. She never rejected the identity as Jew. She said that she embraced that, what she called a race, but that she also saw her project as being bigger than just focused on one race. She talked about herself as being inspired by the image of the biblical Judith. So she saw herself as that kind of figure, which again, it's a violent kind of image of cutting off the head of the enemy. And she was part of a radical milieu that was very much a Jewish milieu. I mean, she often spoke in Yiddish. She worked with many, many Jews. She was part of many things that were seen, again, at the time as being anti-Jewish. For example, she was often part of these parties and picnics and balls that were held on Yom Kippur, which were seen, of course, as a way of kind of flouting tradition and spitting in the face of Jewish tradition by having a Yom Kippur picnic or a Yom Kippur ball. But of course, choosing to do those things on Yom Kippur is a way of celebrating it and marking it and saying, I haven't forgotten that I'm Jewish and this is a holy day. I'm just going to choose to mark that in a really different way. And one of my favorite stories about Emma Goldman is that she showed up to one of these balls dressed as a nun, and she performed a dance called the Anarchist Slide. So when we think about like a moment in history we'd like to go back to, that's it for me. I want to see Emma Goldman dance the Anarchist Slide.
So that's amazing. And that was one of my introductions to Emma Goldman was the Yom Kippur Ball, and it was through the Jewish Women's Archive that I learned that. Any other closing thoughts about Emma Goldman and her role in Jewish history and what looking back at her life can teach us today?
I'm really inspired by the way that Emma Goldman never was willing to compromise her principles. And she wasn't afraid to be different from other people. It wasn't for her about belonging, although she very much loved being part of the radical community she was part of. It was really about being able to be fully free. And in a way that I think also is very Jewish. She was very much filled with passion and believed that freedom was about joy and love and beauty, which weren't particularly popular anarchist concepts at the time. Those things were seen as sort of frivolous. And I think that, she really brought a vision. She's, of course, famous for whether or not she said this or not, but she claims she said this, and lots of people in the 70s picked this up and made all kinds of T-shirts of it, saying when she was criticized for wanting to dance at at an anarchist gathering, she said, "If I can't dance, it's not my revolution," or something of the sort. But I think that idea that there's a kind of playfulness and there's a need to fulfill our full humanity, that it can't only be, even though she was so focused on politics, that politics can't be dry and theoretical. It has to be part of our lived experience and our day-to-day life and feed ourselves and nourish us in all kinds of ways, not just intellectually. And so I think that's something that the Jewish community could really learn from in terms of what it means to live a full and meaningful Jewish life.
Thank you so much for speaking about this artifact. It's been really fascinating.
Thanks for including me in the conversation.
We hope you've enjoyed listening in to this bonus episode of Judaism Unbound, and we also encourage you to check out all of our other historical bonus conversations by heading to Apple Podcast or Stitcher or Overcast or anywhere else where podcasts are featured. As always, we encourage you to be in touch with us, and you can always hit us up via email at dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com with any questions, follow-ups, concerns, comments, whatever you've got. So thanks so much for listening, and with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.